Omar just said his superpower is clapping and getting the people coming in from the outside. His other superpower is to line up a series of talks that really nicely build on each other. I thought this would be an outlier, but turns out it's not at all. It's just building on what was talked about before. Maybe a couple of words to my background, just so that you know what questions to ask me and which ones not. I'm not a theoretical computer scientist. My background is in sociology and statistics, and I've worked for about 20 years in Maryland, primarily in a role that did research together with the federal statistical agencies in DC and training people who work at the Census Bureau or NIH and those kind of places, right? So I have a very, for you guys, extremely applied side perspective on these problems. But that means you can ask me about data collection all day long, and I likely have some insights. So what I want to present here today is something that came out of the Simons semester on large language models about a year ago. And what was initially some early discussions with Richard Zemel, I'm glad you're here, Rich, turned into a broader vision and a project proposal that's currently under review and hopefully got funded. And so I want to discuss a couple of aspects with you. But the general vision of this proposal is that we find a way to leverage decades. I wouldn't go that far as to say centuries, but certainly decades, maybe 50, 60 years of social science research data to infuse into post-training and benchmarking. And I think, Richard, I got the term living benchmark from you. If not, then I'll credit you with it anyway. But into basically an infrastructure system that allows you to, on an ongoing basis, leverage the kind of data collection that the agencies do, but also social science researchers do, so that LLMs can become properly culturally and context aware, in order for all of us to then have a chance to be treated more fairly. I'm not going to go into the definition here, what that means, but we can do that context specific. But in a situation where, in my opinion, we cannot avoid for AI agents to be involved in the decision, right? And maybe one quick side note on what do I mean with social science research data. These can be surveys, but a large chunk of them that are also administrative data logs that many of us here are probably unaware they exist, but especially in Europe, but increasingly also in the US. Things you do leave a digital trace. You get employed somewhere, someone logs how much you earn, what kind of job you work in, and things like that, because eventually you're eligible for benefits. Hence, a little bit more of those data in Europe than here, maybe. But it is important to get that right, whether it's your pension or your unemployment benefit or what have you. Health records, the German health system is very into measuring how often you were at the dentist so that you get some bonus points later down the road. Anyway, so lots of logs, right? So it's opinion data, but it's also behavioral data and a mixture of the two. And all of these data place you in some context, whether it's you within a family or you within an employer, which means we also know something about the people that work with you at the same employment agencies, right? So that's the kind of data I'm talking about. Okay. So the open questions for me here that I would like to discuss and get critical pushbacks, if you will, is how do we get to this framework of adaptive alignment or living benchmarks, or however we want to call it? And I have preliminary work that I'll share with you why I think it is possible to get to a framework where this could work. But conveniently, Cynthia is sitting right there in front of me, reminding me that there are huge privacy implications, and they are. And so one of the things that I would like to discuss with you is what format these data could be used so that we don't run into insurmountable problems. And then, less likely to find someone in the audience here who can answer that, but I'll have put it up anyway as an open question for us to discuss, is sort of, if we were to do a pilot study, if we were to demonstrate that this kind of new symbiosis of data collectors with model generators makes sense, what is a use case that really would grab an investor or funder attention? And with an eye on Europe and the discussions we had just before the break, I think some of this would maybe allow for an audible system that would meet the EU AI Act requirements. But the EU AI Act, for those of you who are less familiar with it, is still a work in progress. I mean, there was a legislation passed, but how it's going to be implemented and punishment for not following it, that's sort of happening actually right now. And within the next 6 months, we'll see a lot of movements on that front. So, okay, so why am I might not sound as passionate because I'm pretty nervous, but why am I actually passionate about this problem? And why I think it's very urgent that we solve it. It's because, as we've heard today repeatedly, but I think all of us also know it, that millions of times these systems get asked questions where a cultural context knowledge is useful. Right? Here, 2 examples, you can, I'm not sure if you should be able to read it, right? Like some sexual advice, behavioral advice that a teenager might want to have, right? You can jump in anytime. Or a research group, whether it's inside a company placing a job ad, whether it's researchers generating synthetic data, as we just heard about the election. Many times, personas now are generated out of these LLMs, and then the LLMs is asked, would that kind of person answer, right? And I'm not saying that any of this should be done, but it is done. And we know it is done because we see looks at that time. What we also know, and that's actually more concerning, or the framework in which I'm thinking about this problem, is that within government agencies, there is a large increase in using generative AI and chatbots in the process of doing what the government is doing, right? Which is helping navigate the system, making decisions, giving advice, all of these. Just to give you a few numbers, there are about 13,000 of such systems in place in the EU as of 2024. In Germany, the number has grown from December 23rd with 108 systems across the federal government, across government agencies, to about 232 of these systems. AI systems, that could be like a machine learning system based on data and a more, I should say, traditional way of doing forecasts. But of those, 30% are generative AI systems, so chatbots. And I think that is a large number given where we are with these chatbots, frankly, right? And so, yeah.
This is reported by the government?
Yeah, yeah. And so these are the officially reported numbers where they feel okay about doing it. There is, I would argue, a way larger proportion of what's called shadow AI, where government agencies, employees, might just on the side, on their phone, use any of these models to help them navigate a difficult system. I'll get back to that later on. I work a lot with general practitioners in Germany, and a large quantity of them reports also that for medical advice, not just their patients ask the system, but they themselves too use it and feeling good about it because they feel like they do a better job with it. And so, just to put a little bit of context on these examples, so the Federal Department of Labor is using AI assistance or language model assistance in determining whether someone is eligible for what's called here child tax credit. In Germany, the system is a little different, but basically they have to make sure that paperwork submitted showing that someone is in school at the university and whatnot is legit, and that this kind of readout and determination is done using generative AI, both a combination of vision and language models. There's a German description in case you are speaking German. On the website, they're tracking these right now. You can learn for any of these systems at which federal, state, or local level they are in place and what is used. The context in which I am working with it more, and some of you met Onai, he interns or works there right now sometimes during the week, is the Institute for Employment Research, which is part of the federal employment agencies. And they have in place now what they call Berufebot, job bot, an AI-supported chatbot that can help you navigate job-related questions. And this internal facing, it supports advisors and job agencies in their preparation for the conversation with the client that would come. And so if you're familiar with Unai's work, you might have seen, or actually not just Unai, Frauke is also here, but there you are. One of the cool things they looked at is it worth investing more into better algorithms or put the resources into increasing the number of the resources to even have these conversations, right? And the resources, increasing the capacity seems to be more effective if you could do it. The problem is we don't have enough people to do that, right? I mean, one is the money, but the other part is the people. And so it is not surprising that they're looking into chatbots to increase the reach or to maybe increase the capacity that way. I don't think they've read your paper, but that could have been a conclusion had they done that at the same time. Okay. Now we're imagining the situation that we currently have, right? We have the employment agent, job center agent, without the chatbot, facing situations in which he or she might struggle to give the right advice, right? In fact, an anecdote from previous years, we have interviewed these job agent folks, and in this context, one of my PhD students actually shared with me that she had helped a young Iranian woman to navigate what to do after school. And she really wanted to study math. And then she went to one of those job centers and tried to figure out what is the job prospect if you do that. And the agent was really steering her away from that idea, having a very German conservative mindset, thinking your parents, there's no way they're gonna support you in studying math and hard science. You do something else, be a teacher or something, right? Very reasonable, but it was clearly because he had a limited mindset and he was not culturally aware that maybe not everyone is so conservative at Bavarians who think their daughters can't do math. So this agent, he in this case, clearly got a wrong perception. So, it is not unreasonable. I had my little bots here earlier. I wanted to point to this, right? It's not unreasonable that they think there could be a positive side effect from having a little chatbot saying, hey, wait a second, different countries, maybe they work differently. Different cultures maybe are okay with it. We have it's a new time now, not like when you grew up or whatever they might say. Okay, so of course we don't believe that is the case because we think, or we know how these language models are trained and the kind of data they get at their input. And we know that, we assume, I guess no one really knows, but we have strong and reasonable assumption that this data doesn't represent our target populations. In part because not everything can be scraped from the internet, and we know that probabilities get increased when you have more incidents, and more incidents are people that scream louder, and the people we want to protect usually are not the ones screaming loud and all of that. So this is known to this audience. And what maybe not all of us are thinking about all the time is that this input is ingested, but then the dialogue format really only works if you have these reinforcement learning with the human feedback processes in place. And in these processes, we see two problems. Oops, sorry. Before I get to the problem. In these processes, we have annotators that get hired and trained by companies. And then they give some feedback on a task, usually, which of these two boxes you like better. If you ask me with my survey methodology head, I can already say this is not the way you measure preferences, but that would be a different topic. So what they have to do then is evaluate these two answers with respect to largely this red box here, right? The goal is to avoid really bad things, right? They should also give an answer that's understandable and all of that, but they also shouldn't say things that are against the law, provide harm, and all of that. And that's good. We like that, you know. I mean, it's reasonable that the answers should at least be within the Constitution. And there are some personalization preferences going on in the feedback loop, but these are, you know, largely the efforts put into in the post-training right now. What I want to argue here is that what we can't get right with the current system of private companies hiring some annotators that also don't reflect the population, that we properly would judge which of the two answer boxes is better, so that in deployment, especially in deployment in some country in another language, we can still get all this squishy stuff of norms that might not be written down and as fixed as laws, but this is how we do stuff right, and then give advice that doesn't quite work and maybe would turn society into something that we see displayed here right now, where all of a sudden you ignore norms and do things that we all thought was similar to laws. So not here in this room, here in this country, I mean, but so one of the problems, I think, has to do with the set of annotators that is hired. Even if they were trained well, many of them grow up in very different countries. They're, compared to the society that's using them, quite homogeneous, because they're usually low SES. They live in countries in which the income is low. If that weren't the case, it would be way too expensive to do it this way, right? And the other problem is that and we heard this earlier this morning about the distribution of answers, right? That we're just going for the majority vote. What is usually considered the better answer, but we're not trying to reflect the distribution at all. So this problem, I'm of course not the first one to point this out. There have been others. One of them, Barbara Planck, for example, she comes out of NLP, pushing for that we take that information that is in this human label variation and use some ways to include it into the training process. I would go a little bit further and say we also need to do this over and over and over again, because the world is changing all the time. So it's not just that we have a distribution today, we have a different distribution tomorrow. And it is complex, and ideally you look at the full variance covariance space on who is giving these answers. And we had some of that discussion earlier with what background variables might be important when you do crowdsourcing. Okay, let me take a sip and see if you have any questions so far. Okay, doesn't seem to be the case. So how would we go about doing it differently? My hope would be that we use a different source, but these annotators. And the idea of the proposal here is that we, at least in addition, maybe not in the first training process, but in the post-training process, make use of all these many data sets of people where we measure opinion and attitudes and their perception of the world, in addition to their behavior and living circumstances. Examples for such data sets could be the General Social Survey that asks attitudinal questions about Americans every year. There's a European social survey is very similar to this. There's an African survey that's designed in a similar way. So I'm not talking about, a survey from Prolific done within a week or 2 days of data collection. I'm talking about large-scale surveys in which the sample is drawn from a known population, a proper sampling frame where you know the selection probabilities and can model out, a pretty good picture of the population. Another example from the US would be the National Survey of Family Growth, which asks not only whether you had a kid or what your family situation is like, but also attitudes around all of it. the American National Election Study, the big NHANES survey, which is sort of on the medical side an important survey because it not only asks people about, let's say, their vaccination intents, but also does full-on physical exams of everybody, and so opinion data, behavioral data, health data, all in one data set, if you will. So these are high-quality survey data, just so we're on the same page. And they have been collected, many of them annually, some cross-sectional, some panel data, so that you actually can measure the change within a person over time. And ideally, a smart model could learn how to use or how to model that over time. But there also is infrastructure for them going forward. They will be key. It will be possible to collect them over time. And with that, they have the chance to become benchmarks that have like unseen data, so that every year there's new data, and you can test whether your models are still somewhat aligned with how the world is evolving. The challenge is, right now, you can't just go to the ICPSR data archive in Michigan or to GESIS in Cologne and say, give me the data. These data are only available to researchers under data use agreements, some more strict than others, but none of them would allow you to just feed them into a model, right? In its current form. It is done for some, the Pew Research Center has put out, well, someone has put out with the Pew Research Center data, this benchmark called opinion QA, so it has happened. But the privacy challenges are real, because if we really would take the entire raw data matrix, turn them into something that the LLMs can work with, and I'll show you in a moment how that looks like, we will get privacy challenges and an unsolved question, in my opinion, but you can tell me that it's solved, that would be even better, is how to do that in a way that we get enough of the information without risking the privacy. And this is a question of aggregation likely, but maybe noise addition or other forms. The next piece is that instead of just using the most common answer, we need to figure out how we reflect the entire distribution. And let me be clear, I'm only talking about how do we get the distribution into the model. In a specific application, I might still need the model to give a specific answer, right? But what I would want is the job center agent to know the distribution and being able, or the bot designed for the job center agent being able to draw on the distribution. So it's like, well, if you do this, the likelihood is that, and if you do that, whatever. Just more context, right? So it's enabling the systems. I'm fully aware that there might be situations in which then the system that gets deployed still gives a majority answer, or gives whatever metric there might be, or the extreme answer because they want to push society to change, or whatever have you, right? But the enabling is the key piece. And then, of course, the challenge will be we probably can't do this for everything at the same time, right? So the involvement of stakeholders to where this has the most chance to succeed is another challenge for me right now. Okay. Yes.
Sort of the super annoying question here, which is the reality that's measured by these incredibly high quality surveys is often an extremely problematic reality. People have horrible opinions and biases, and this is not just to sort of accepting that at face value, but in some sense seeking to reify or reinforce this?
Yeah, so exactly. This is a challenge and a question that I think anyone hearing this in today's world would think, well, no, we definitely don't want to see this change. And I have some time series plots at the end that would support this, right? In Germany right now, we have a big discussion that people, especially females, shouldn't be allowed to work part-time anymore. We need more labor, so everyone should work full-time again. It's ridiculous, as if we wouldn't have more important things to worry about. But there is a shift, in not recognizing certain things that we've learned before, for sure. Right? My answer to this is twofold. I think if these chatbots give advice, they have to be aware of the context, right? Let's take that mathematician, should I study math example, right? If you want to give good advice and you totally ignore whether in a workplace you could succeed or you would struggle or you would need to have certain personality characteristics for it to work or whether your parents would support it or not, that would not be good. As a human, we do this, and I would expect these models to do it too, right? That doesn't mean they would discourage you. It's just it should go into the decision-making set. That's sort of the one. The other one I would say, yeah, go ahead.
To understand what you're saying right now in answer to the question, are you saying that the answer should be, well, let's talk about your family and let's talk about what kind of workplace you might be in and so on and so forth in order to give a more complete picture? Or do you have in mind that the answer is going to be more on the range of between yes and no?
No, the former. The former, because I think, and that's why, I mean, the good news about these chatbots currently deployed too is, and within the EU AI Act framework, the latter wouldn't be allowed anyway, right? It would always be a human in the loop, having at least the final say. But ideally, I would say a good chatbot, the way I envision it, would.
I meant the bot having this
Right. Exactly. That's where I was going. A good chatbot would push it to ask all these questions that are relevant, right? To look at the life trajectory data and see, well, you can succeed, with these other conditions that weren't in place for all the people who didn't succeed, or whatever the learning might be. But assuming that we could just ignore a change in the society or not look at what development has happened in the past seems naive to me, right? And so, and actually, what are we comparing it against? Right now, we are comparing it against chatbots that have learned about the society, but in a very unrepresentative and unstructured way, right? And one that I couldn't audit and whatnot. So given that as an alternative, then I rather have one that is, at least learning on data that I feel like I can trust. So that would be my answer. Okay. So what has been done that makes me believe this could work, right? We have seen already surveys being used for the evaluation of large language models and for improving deployment in a static fashion. So the evaluation usually is done in a, I would say, from my perspective, a bit simplistic way, but in situations like these, you would have, for the regular survey, a question like this one: how much, if at all, do you worry about the following happened to you, being a victim of a terrorist attack, whatever. And then some question. And this is just a random example. And in the same way, models get queried and then evaluated on whether they get the population distribution right. And there have been really a large number of papers that basically use this. There's an input, there's a model, there's an output, and there's an evaluation. And I'm seeing Tatiana right here, who has worked on this a lot, and also trying to calibrate then these kind of tasks better. Sometimes we have learned over time, but I mean in the last 2 years, that there are challenges because models show interesting behaviors. For example, that they give you one output, but the most likely next token is actually something else. So we have seen this in different applications. Likely this has to do with the safety alignment, is the hypothesis of many, but that just as an unresolved challenge left. We have seen much better performance when these answers are given in open-ended format rather than pressing them into an ABCD category, and I think the way we would imagine chatbot to work with these open question formats. We have seen that there is. I guess I've switch these slides around. So the open-ended free text format works better in this case. So instead of having all these scales and answers, even so they went into the training set itself, the models do better when they can express their answers in sentences rather than these standardized categories. And this one was just a hint that the way you prompt the models, how they give you the answer, also has a great effect on their ability to get this right. So whether you give them a fixed set, whether you allow them to take a stance, or whether you force them to give a directional answer. So basically, we have seen them being able to reproduce societal values. Sometimes you have to use calibration to get the distribution right. But all of these examples, or most of these examples, are on marginals or bivariate distribution at most, right? I have not seen anything that would get even into the direction that I mentioned before, and that's probably for the privacy reasons that we discussed, that people didn't dare to put these data out as benchmarks or for evaluation that really would model an entire life history, if you will, right? Okay. So could it work to have a small set? I mean, I remember when we were in Berkeley for the LLM, workshop, I talked to someone from Anthropic and tried to sell him on this idea, and he said, these surveys are tiny. These surveys are tiny. We learn on like big data sets, Like how? I mean, this is not worth my time. And I tried to say, well, but high quality data, and you learn distributions that matter. He was not convinced, But I think we talked past each other because he was thinking of the initial training, the pre-training process. And since then, we have actually seen quite a bit of work. This is one of them that show that in the fine-tuning or in the post-training step, that this is the line I wanted to point out to with the not pointer. That in the safety aligning, that a few examples can be enough to change what was learned before. And actually, we know this from the jailbreak literature, right? You can, those people who have malicious actors, they also use relatively few samples to make the model do something or tell them something that they have learned not to do, right? And so I could imagine an environment, let's go back to that job center job agency, in which deployed there, the model has few sample that's learned, or that's used sort of in this last step between for post-training before the safety alignment, where you add this additional information, right? And then you prevent the malicious actors from coming in and destroying it all. I mean, that would be the idea, because the alignment at that stage is brittle and will probably keep being that way.
I can ask a little bit more about what the goal here is. So suppose that there's a particular issue on which there's some population distribution of opinions. Is our goal for the LLM to simulate a draw from that population, so to act like a typical human and have an opinion from that distribution? Or is our goal for the model to somehow synthesize that distribution and represent that distribution in some way? Is it a sample, or is it the distribution that we want in a particular interaction with the LLM?
Most of the interaction that I sort of envisioned are on the sample, on the distribution side. But I'm a little biased in my perception because I see them being used as data generating machines, for the social science researchers, where they want a proper population drawn out of it. So samples, yes, but many samples, right? And those samples then jointly should represent the distribution so that you can run some pretests on it or some simulations or what have you. In a particular deployment, I think that's similar to Cynthia's question earlier, right? That I could see settings in which you just want a sample being drawn, but I think the real benefit would come in situations where you have a chat, where you have a dialogue, and where more knowledge and more cultural aware knowledge is needed. I was talking a couple of weeks ago to someone from Microsoft who worked on that Phi-3 model, these little edge models that you can put on devices. And he said, when we deploy to Europe, we only translate into 10 languages, right? And for those 10 languages, we really make sure that the alignment sort of works, that what's answered works in that language and still means what we thought it should mean. But if you end up using it in a different language, and we have many more languages but 10, across Europe, certainly, even in any given country with all the immigrations, then who knows what they answer? I mean, it might still translate it because they have learned how to translate it, but there is no extra step has been made, right, to get that part right. And those are the steps that I'm talking about. I'm not envisioning a decider machine, that looks but to really just get these interactions right that already happen today in a way that I think are likely wrong. So does that answer your question? Okay. And it can work. Actually, that nicely fits the next slide. It can work. Paul Rodka and Daniel Herkovich and a bunch of others have tried this out with the World Opinion Poll, or the World Value Survey, I believe they used, where they, instead of doing the yes/no, for a certain training setting, they used the distribution from these data, and the way they did this was that they would train the models on derivatives of the survey data. So in this case here, they would know the right answers from the survey, but then they would instruct the model, for example, how would someone from Andorra answer the following question, and they give the question that is on the survey, and then they provide the answer options that the Andorran people could have had, and then they instruct the language model to give their answer as one of these option distributions, and then they get rewarded if they get close to the right data that they got from the survey. So that's basically the training input flow that they used, and the World Value Survey is really done across the world. So they did this for many countries. And in this case, the survey's around 4 more, but they used 46 countries, 8 African countries, and so you see that description on the right there. That was pretty fascinating because they looked then in their paper to create these simulated data sets of the population that I was talking about before, and saw that these distribution learning really helped to get synthetic data that looked much better than what is traditionally done when you just prompt and say, imagine you are a person of that type, whom would you vote for, right? Which is sort of what we've seen in most of the other applications. Now, getting the distribution is the interesting piece because sorry, yeah.
Difference between doing that versus giving all this training, all these surveys as training data? It's just an experiment to give it, but in this particular paper?
Yeah, I had the same question for a long time, and this is why I showed this paper before. So the distributions, when you give them this way, it's not enough information to outweigh all the other training data that's used for these models to even have any kind of reasonable chance at talking to you, right? So it would, in order for them to be effective, it would need to be in post-training. And so the post-training team at Google, the Gemini post-training team, they are using the few benchmarking data sets that are out there coming out of these surveys to see if they get this roughly right, when they do all of the other reinforcement learning pieces that they do. But they too say this would be incredibly valuable for us to have in post-training. they don't think it would make any difference in the pre-training, in the actual training. But I haven't trained the model myself, so what do I know? I'm relying on these experts to tell me that. But it makes sense to me that relative to the volume of data that is used before and after, and then given all these experiments done in the alignment, in the safety training research, that how effective they can be to actually change the answer when you insert them afterwards, I do think that could have a reasonable shot. Okay, so now, okay, after seeing this paper by Zhao and others, I thought, okay, well, let's just turn everything into like AI readiness. That was the reason the UN statistical division pushed for this report, right? It's like how we collect all this data across the world. Let's make them AI ready. You know, we're open science. We want to make this happen, but then, of course, they say, it's like, well, only the aggregates, you know, marginal distributions. And we know that intersectionality matters for many questions, right? We wouldn't want only the aggregates, because that is almost like a majority vote on something, at least in my opinion, right? I think it's not fine-grained enough. And so the open question, you know, and this report from the UN makes it very clear that by no means, you know, should the raw data ever be used for these models. And I don't think that's the right instruction. I think we have to figure out how it could be used, right? How could we get the richness out of these data for them to be useful? What does it mean to put the raw data into the model is another interesting question, right? Because you can't just like upload a data table. The LLMs wouldn't understand what that is. They don't understand the rows and the columns and the relationship between them, right? So you have to turn them into text. And what was the question? No, okay. One interesting newish approach and actually infrastructure that has been built last year is one coming out of Princeton and there you are. Probably people in the room involved in it, but anyway, I talked to Max Sargonik at length, right? He was presenting that also at Simon's earlier this year. They created a technical infrastructure called the Book of Life, you know, which basically is a way to turn these millions and millions of records from administrative data sets, in their case in the Netherlands, into a piece of text that actually is very rich and would be very difficult to, even in classical statistical analysis, to really to have a structured data set that has that richness of information. And what do you mean by that? Imagine your employment spells, right? And Katrina and I, we shared interesting employment histories, right? Some spells here, different percentages here, on leave here, you know, whatever have you. And then, you know, different living arrangements and different housing sizes and what have you. As a statistician, I hear this and I was like, okay, yeah, no problem. I have a data set that's sort of Katrina and her family. These are the members. And then, you know, these are the different employment places. And then for each employment place, you need a spell data set and so on and so on. And that gets very complicated. And, you know, rarely have we traditional analysis method that really would take the richness of all of this into account, you know. In language, we can be so much more efficient, right? Look at the difference between this first sentence here. From January 31st, 2000 to June 12th, 2019, James lived in Amsterdam, right? And then the next where he lived in, that's like 3 pieces of information. With the few words, you learn a ton more about this, right? And you get that context, right? But it would be difficult, you know, to feed that in. And so I encourage you to look at this paper and the follow-up papers because they've really created beautiful machinery to turn such complex data into data that actually can be used in a microdata way to train these models. And then privacy, right? Now this is identifying as it can get, right? So how do we turn this text, you know, into something that the model can learn from, you know, reasonably enough for this complexity without every single one being visible? Or could we imagine, well, We only want to use it in post-training. It's deployed within an agency, under certain regulations. Maybe this is a safe space where this could work, and these aren't models that we put out in the wild. Unclear to me where the solution lies, but I think that is an interesting discussion to think through. Yeah. I think it was on.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Just in the previous slide,
Yeah.
so the red information, how did they get this? I'm sorry if you said this already. How did they get this extra information? Is it by doing a join with the other information?
That's right. These administrative records often have only one element of your life, right? In order for them to be really useful for any analysis, we often join from different record systems, let's say the schooling, the population registry, together with these information so that you have the combined information. That's all this push that we have seen in the US for evidence-based policymaking often stopped at making just one data source available with which you can't do that much because the context is missing, right? It really needs an environment in which they can be linked. But when they're linked, they get really complicated records for doing good analysis with our traditional statistical techniques, right? Yet to be seen if it gets any better, if the language model learned from it. But at least language is a very efficient way to convey what is now in the joint data sets. That was the point to be made here. Okay, so the last piece in the puzzle is, can they learn the concept? Can they learn a moral concept? Can they learn a value, right? Is that even something that you can get across? In tier 2, I think we can learn or get ideas from the safety alignment community. Because, so Sarah Ball, who also was at the assignments workshop, the semester on large language models, she was interested in, can we extract or can we find a vector of harmfulness, in these models, right? And the way you can see this, you could just imagine you prompt a model with something that they shouldn't be telling you how to kill yourself, how to build a bomb, these classic examples. And then you ask maybe a bit more complex sentence, but then you ask a question that has a very similar structure, and then you put something harmless instead of the bomb, right? And when you then take the probabilities at the last token or somewhere before, subtract the two from each other, you can see, if you do this a lot, you can build up and find, in the model architecture, vectors that represent harmfulness, because when you then apply the difference between the two, that vector to the model, you all of a sudden get the result. So this is one way of getting to these jailbreak answers, right? And so that means that there is a representation of these larger concepts, right? It would be interesting to see if it has a concept of fairness, but maybe we can teach it a concept of fairness, right? By having enough examples of fair, unfair, and then making sure we test for, is there now a vector representation of a concept rather than just probabilities of events and the like. And we have done this in the political space, where we looked at, for several different countries, we looked at something similar to party manifestos, if you will, so positions and stands that parties have. And then compared this to, basically we looked at the internal representation of these parties when the model gets probed to it, relative to survey data, or what the LLM would answer if you just say you're this and this kind of persona, what would you answer? And there too, we saw that that the models have learned something about the world by ingesting the internet, as one often says, that is pretty solid and in line with the party manifesto. So to me, that and experiments that people have done to see, can we just really forcefully train a model to have certain moral perception of the world and then test them on tasks that we see often in the ethics world, that it is possible to teach them these larger concepts. So this said, coming back to Katrina's question, if we were then to have the model change at some point what it says or how it probes or what it says, what amount of change in the world would start the model? It's like, okay, now it's a real change. Now it's something where like I have to adjust my knowledge, right? Where, okay, it's like now it, this was a question in the general social survey, is it wrong for the same-sex adults to have a sexual relationship? Well, in 1975, the world was different than it is now. And maybe in another 50 years, it will be different again, right? But when will a model pick this up? Is any blip in the change of the data already something that it would include in its communication behavior? And there are many examples of this. And so this relates to me actually, brings up a different question that we won't have time to talk about today. It's like, how much of this learning, whether it's an LLM or we as human, is fixed in our head? And when do we learn something new and says, oh, now it's time to update, right? So Pluto, no longer a planet. Okay, we all updated our model about the solar system. But what does it take to change your knowledge? And what would it take to change an LLM knowledge? And so maybe a topic for next year. But anyway, so with this, one last little tip of an application, and maybe this helps you think through when I think this is useful. I mentioned that we are working with these general practitioners in Germany. We had a pilot study where a chatbot that we created would call up the 60+ and tries to make vaccination appointments with them, and if they have questions, answer the question, right? And we gave it instructions on how they should answer these, but it was a language model. It could make variations around it. And in the RTC that we did, it did work. It increased the vaccination rate. In the end, people did go more to the doctor and were vaccinated. But clearly, the model could have had better conversations if it would know the universe of concerns that there is, and all of these things. And goes back to what we heard earlier, also a little scary because, of course, you could use this in ways that are not so great. So with these, thank you very much.